On this episode of RotoViz Overtime, we are going to talk about forgiveness. It's time to forgive the players who broke our hearts in 2023 because, stepping back, looking at the information and seeing what the outcomes are for these players in 2024 could win you a league championship. And that is what we're here to do, is to try and win league championships, win best ball tournaments, win some cash on the side, win bragging rights against our friends in our home leagues, all those things. So that means that forgiving at certain times may be necessary for these players. Are you ready to get back in? Are you ready to potentially get your heart broken again? You have to factor all these things in. So we are joined by Kevin Szafraniec on today's episode, RotoViz.com writer. We're going to talk through forgiveness is the key to healing part 1 and part 2. They're up on RotoViz.com, where it details 8 names who kind of broke our hearts last year, who we need to forgive to win leagues this year. So we're going to start off with part 1. We're going to go into part 2 later in the show. But Kevin, how are you as we kick things off here today?
I'm doing great. How about you, Colm?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm set up. I'm waiting now to peel back the curtain. We are recording this one on the 26th of June. It will be, held back as a bonus episode at some point here of RotoViz OT, because these players will be in conversation throughout the offseason. But I'm getting ready this weekend for my brother's stag party, which we call it here. It's a bachelor party. He's getting married at the end of July. So I've been organizing that, and pretty busy week here trying to get, ready for that. So in terms of, there's some higher blood pressure, I think, this week between trying to get all the work commitments, family commitments, all those sort of things done. But I'm excited for this week, excited for this show. Anytime you get to talk about fantasy football is always a good time. So we're ready to dive in. Forgiveness. Tell me about forgiveness, and why should we start even thinking about forgiving players that have broken our hearts in previous years?
Well, there's a really good reason. As I go in the intro to the articles, I pretty much talk about Kyren Williams because, in his rookie year, I had him at some point in 2022. I think I had him pretty much in every single one of my dynasty rosters. I drafted him in a lot of rookie drafts. I didn't really care too much. I thought he was a clear value after his testing came out, the poor testing, and he started dropping down. I didn't really care, so
Terrible
I added
testing.
him. Yeah, terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was skinny back. He didn't even come in at 200 pounds. He was slow. He was everything that we don't want. But I didn't care. So I said, I still believe in this guy. But then, so after, he got hurt his rookie year, even when he did come back, he wasn't very efficient. He was just kind of meh. He was a meh player in his rookie year. So pretty much I just dropped him off of every single roster. Didn't really bother to pick him back up in rookie drafts. And then we all know what happened after that. So I did, as far as like best ball, I did get back on him right towards the end, but there was no way that I was even going to be like at market in my exposure to him last year. So essentially, due to basically him letting me down in his rookie season, him not living up to my expectations of what I thought he should be, I was pretty much out on the biggest ADP value for 2023. And I still did pretty well, but really if I would have had Kyren Williams on a lot of my underdog rosters, I would have done I would have done very, very, very well. Yes. And
and he was like, there was a couple of players last year, and 2 of them on the LA Rams, that other one being Puka Nacua, but a couple of players in the last few rounds of fantasy drafts last year that, not only were beneficial to your roster, but kind of broke the game in terms of how they helped with win rates and helped teams advance or to win contests, win money, win leagues last season. So we know the why now behind it. So we start off this, right? We're going to talk with players you need to forgive. Why do you need to forgive players? You need to forgive them because they could win the whole thing for you. Mm-hmm. We got an example in Kyren Williams. Now we're going to talk about, we're just going to talk about a few of these guys. So there's 4 names in each article. We're going to tease it out. The links will be in today's show notes if you want to check out the rest. I'm going to give the author of the article, Kevin, the driving or the steering wheel here to decide which players we talk about. So part 1, there's 4 names. Which name is up first here?
We'll start with Anthony Richardson. He really, he was delivering on what we thought he was going to be, or like one of the high upside. We all knew that he was not going to be an elite passer. That was a given. I didn't think anybody think he was going to come in and look like Tom Brady or Peyton Manning. But in those first few weeks of the season, he was delivering even in the week 2 against Houston. I mean, he finished as a QB2 even though he went out with a concussion in the early second quarter. I mean, I remember sitting around watching that game, and he was in one of my starting lineups and in one of my home leagues, and I was just like licking my chops. I was like, oh, this is it. This is what we've been waiting for. And then I think that was the game where he was going into the end zone. He kind of slowed up a little bit as he crossed the goal line, and somebody pushed him and he banged his head against the turf. And I remember seeing that and I was like, oof, it just seems like he had this reckless abandon with his body. Even in like that sort of situation, he wasn't fighting for extra yards. He just kind of said, okay, like I'm in the end zone. So I think a lot of it's just, hopefully he's more cognizant this year.
You're not expecting that, maybe in college you mightn't get that hit. And, it's easy to say that's a rookie mistake. Technically it's a second week in the NFL, but, this time if it happens, I think that he, continues at his, maintains his trajectory rather than slows down. And obviously he could have got hit the same way and not bumped his head and had no concussion and all that. But starts off week 1 against the Jaguars, 23.1 points, 18.3 points. Obviously misses week 3. Then he's in week 4, 31.6 points that week. Then he does get injured again in week 5. He was at 5.4 points at that particular point. But in terms of what he was doing through the 3 performances that he had was massive. He was averaging 19.6 PPR points per game, and that's factoring in that 5.4 game being included in that game or in that sample size. But the other part of that is the injuries were factored in when people had concerns. You mentioned the passing element was factored in when people had concerns last season. So kind of both of those parts did come to fruition, which affected his season. He ended up being injured and couldn't contribute. But that also ends up with, players, fantasy players, that is, being disappointed. They drafted him, gets injured early in the season. But he is currently going as the quarterback 6 for this season, right behind CJ Stroud, going ahead of guys like Joe Burrow, Kyler Murray, and Dak Prescott. What are your thoughts on? Do you think people were really disappointed, let down with that draft selection, that it's going to impact them this year? Do you think he should be going higher than he's currently going? And then what's your thoughts on him for this season?
I like his price where it is because we don't know. We don't know if he's going to. We would all like to believe that he's not going to take those hits. We believe that, that
there is some players that it, doesn't come out of. You'll remember like Andrew Luck, for example, loved the physical nature of the game. Russell Wilson and Robert Griffin, the 3 of those guys obviously coming into the league together. He took hits, got banged up, and had a couple of bad injuries that curtailed his career. So there is a way that he can not get hit as much, but there's also a way that it continues to happen again. And the fact is that he could then get injured again in week 4 or week 5. But I think in terms of range of outcomes for injuries last season, this was also season-ending injury in the first portion of the season and also missing a game and a half with concussion. Like it really went as bad as it could have went. It could happen that way again, but more than likely, even in an injury-curtailed season, there's more games to be played for him. And then the upside of quarterback 1 multiple weeks is there as well.
Yeah, and I think, really the comp that I always liken him to is Cam Newton. Cam Newton wasn't the greatest passer. He had some okay completion percentages, but he reminds me of Cam Newton.
Season top 5 quarterback.
Mm-hmm. And it's like his running style and the not funny, it's actually really sad. Cam pretty much the shoulder injury is what took Cam Newton out towards the end. He couldn't even throw the ball. And then the first injury that Richardson gets is a shoulder injury to take on. So that's not awesome. But so looking at kind of how Steichen used Hurts when he was in Philadelphia, as the goal line, the talk about the tush push and things like that. Like Richardson averaged 12.5 rushing points per game over those first 4 games that he played. And I don't really think that's sustainable, but as long as he's getting that goal line work, he's going to have a good amount of rushing upside. So I'm kind of hoping that maybe they decide to use Jonathan Taylor between the 20s and really try to save Richardson for more like the goal line, things in close. They're not hopefully, opening him up to all that risk. I mean, he's going to scramble and do all those things, but hopefully he's not, trying to get 3 extra yards in October in the first quarter of a game when it doesn't really matter. Hopefully there's just more so
you're telling me we're turning Jonathan Taylor into DeAndre Swift. That's what you're telling me.
I haven't been drafting very much, so I don't, unfortunately, maybe, but that's just kind of how I'm hoping it works out. But at the same time, you can't take somebody's competitive edge out of them. If he's a competitive guy, he wants to get every yard. It's not like he can just turn that off when he's in the middle, when he has, 250-pound men running full speed at him. So we'll see, but he's definitely worth taking the shot on. A lot of the stuff that's really that you have to weigh against that is the opportunity cost of the players that you're not going to be able to get if you are drafting him, like Xavier Worthy, Jaden Reed, Kyle Pitts are all right in that range over on Underdog. So it's like it's kind of hard to pass up all those guys to get over the market on Richardson. I'm hoping I get to like 12-16% exposure. I'm definitely not there yet. I think I'm just about at market on him currently where I'm drafting. But ideally, 12% would be kind of nice, just to get, about 50% above market on him, because he really is one of those, if he takes off, if he can stay healthy, he is one of the quarterbacks he could jump into the top 3, top 4 guys, pretty easily. So
I think the way they kind of ideally played, you want to get some of them on the roster, but you mentioned some of those names. Keenan Allen's a player I'm also targeting in that range, but if those names are gone, I think he becomes the clear pick at that point. If you can get him 10 to 12 picks after ADP, I think every time that he gets to that point, I think he's a must add to your roster. I think at ADP fair value as well, but I'm just saying in terms of the cost versus what you can also pick up at that point of the draft. Let's jump to the next player, next position. Who have we got here at the running back zone?
Another OT favorite from last year, Kendre Miller is somebody I definitely, I had a good exposure. I don't remember. I was definitely way above market on him last year. But so when I started, before the Super Bowl even kicked off, when I first started seeing his name on all those big board drafts, I had a hard time clicking it because I just, that one, the hurt was real. I have no problem admitting it. But kind of over time, just let those feelings calm down. Just start thinking rationally. Don't think with your think with your heart. Think with your head. His situation has not changed, especially after the draft. They could have the Saints definitely could have added a running back. There's plenty of good, mid to late round running backs that the team could have added. But that's a pretty good signal that they do still, I feel like, believe in Kendre Miller, especially with Alvin Kamara and Jamal Williams as the other options on the roster, not really playing very well, not playing efficiently. I mean, Kamara's numbers look good, but his efficiency is not. He's not the
volume driven.
Yeah. He was an efficiency superstar in his career or his early career. Like that's what really that was like the highlight of who he was. And that is not really the case anymore. Just looking at his FPOE ranks from 2020 on. So 2020, he was still number 2 in FPOE among running backs. But then 21, he was 153rd. 22, he's 137th. 23, 121st. So, I mean, he's not that guy anymore. But they're just making him kind of that guy just by giving him so much volume that he's still, hanging around as a borderline RB1. But, I mean, we know that when these running backs fall off, they fall off the cliff, and it's not to say that that's not going to be this year for Kamara. So,
and similar with Williams, obviously had a huge run previously, and then got the deal with the Saints, but very inefficient, very disappointing numbers across the board last season for him as well. So really, the case here is it's not just the case that you're building, that he gets some work. There's the potential here for Kendre Miller and it's going to be tricky. Obviously, we're dealing with this contract situation at the moment with Kamara, but Miller is somebody who I think can really poach a huge amount of the share here away from those two guys this season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's fun too, because I went into the BSS, generally we're doing this during people's rookie seasons. So, but what I did is I, went back and went to the box score scout and ran the sims for Miller now. And at the top of there's Darius Geis, who I mean, despite all of his off the field problems and injuries, he was a very good prospect. And then Miles Sanders also comes up, to a lesser extent, Kerryon Johnson, but also going back now a year into his career and running the box score scout. It includes this year's rookies, and Blake Corum and Jonathan Brooks both jumped on the list after that. So it's kind of nice to get that little extra, after the fact, a couple extra comps of one player that we're really excited about, and one that could do something. Not super excited about Blake Corum, but I know Matt Irby just put a piece up on the site about Blake Corum that I'm very excited to read, because when we were kind of going through in our little chat, picking who the players, I looked at my underdog exposure when Matt said he was wanting to do a Blake Corum, and I found out that I was like 14% exposure on Blake Corum, which I wasn't expecting. So I haven't read it yet, but I'm very excited to go read that piece right now. But they're both players that have a lot of potential, and they just got added to his comps. So the BSS comps for Miller are pretty good. There's some good, intriguing names on there.
Let's get into the wide receivers and tight ends. I know people are going to be excited to hear those. We're only going to share one off the names from each position. We have a few interesting names in there. I don't know which direction, again, you're going to pull this. There's a particular player that I'm very hopeful that jumps in to the list here, but hit me with the wide receiver first.
So at wide receiver, I'm going to go with Marvin Mims. I don't know if that's the one that you wanted. I feel like the other person that's on there gets a lot of...
gets a lot of airtime. Yes. We'll keep that as a teaser. It was the tight end that I'm interested in, but let's go with the Marvin Mims is somebody who I've drafted quite a bit of this season. I've actually drafted more Troy Franklin than Marvin Mims, but I am, for people who are listening to RotoViz OT or Stealing Bananas or a lot of the content on the channels, Bo Nix is kind of one of the later round quarterback targets. And with the way drafts play out, you can quite easily pair him with, some of his receiving options, even maybe a Cortland Sutton. So I've been kind of drafting both of those guys and sprinkling them across those rosters. And even if it's not a Bo Nix team, but you have Marvin Mims written up here. So I have already forgiven him. Do I need to forgive him further based on the information that, maybe other people haven't forgiven him? Tell us the case here.
I think he's a good pick where he's at. I'm not going over the top. I mean, I have like 25% exposure to him right now, I think. So I'm drafting him a lot, but at the same time, I still have more Troy Franklin. I think I'm close to 30% on him. So that kind of tells you where I'm at. But I think they're both good picks, and I feel like there is, an equal chance that both of them produce, and there's also a good chance that both of them produce. So, basically kicked off last year. He was like a waiver wire darling in the first quarter of the season because he had the two wide receiver 2 finishes in the first 3 games.
Yeah.
And I remember, because I had drafted him at the back end of a few rosters, maybe dropped him on a couple, and then, ran back to the waiver wire, put him back on my teams. And then after that, it was pretty much crickets for the rest of the year.
It was extremely bizarre, as you point out in the article. He had 91 and 127 air yards in week 2 and week 3. So and they ended up with 20.3 points week 2, 16.6 points week 3. But then after the season, or as the season progressed the rest of the way, only over 50 air yards twice the rest of the season. That was probably the most bizarre. You felt like the usage at the start of the season in terms of the air yards that he was getting would have either been there at certain points, but it just never came back. And the strain gets the air yards, has the success, and then it vanished. And in terms of the weeks that he had, they're just, if you weren't playing best ball, where you don't have to select them is one thing, but if you're in a season-long league, and you mentioned the waiver wire element, people will be crushed by this because it goes 6.7 points, 1.40 against the Packers. He has a minus 1.1 game, 1 point. Then he has a 0 minus 0.3 game. So it's not even that it's like zeros in your lineup; it's negative points. So that's not easy. That will cause some heartbreak that people will have to forgive. What are you expecting this season for the Broncos? Do you think we get Nix in there as the quarterback, and there's a big improvement on what we've seen from Wilson last season?
That's how I'm drafting it. Without Sutton being there at OTAs, it's really given the young guys a chance. And they did bring in Josh Reynolds. So that is, he's been one of those guys that's I don't say a thorn for exciting prospects. I mean, it seems like no matter where he goes, Josh Reynolds gets
in the end zone
some
a couple
work.
of times.
Yeah, he gets some work, and he sees the field, so that's a little bit concerning. But I'm still like the Knicks Franklin Mims stack at the end of drafts. I feel like, I mean, it could be like a 2024 cheat code. The only thing that's only like really kind of rough thing about that is just, I mean, the week 14 buys this year are rough. It's just, there's so many exciting good teams that are on that week 14 buy. So that's one of the things that has kind of made me a little bit hesitant sometimes adding Knicks at the end. If I'm only trying to do, if I have an elite quarterback, say I have either Lamar Jackson or CJ Stroud on my team, and then I come, to the end, I'll have one elite guy, and then I'll have kind of like a lower tier guy. And trying to add Knicks there, it's just the buys don't really work out very well. So that's really the only thing that has really stopped me from adding a lot of the Broncos guys at the end of drafts is basically just bye weeks. Otherwise, I'm just full go trying to get those stacks at the end of drafts.
The other thing, you mentioned Josh Reynolds, and I don't think he'll impact them as much as people might think. He's heading into his 9th season in the NFL. He has a season in Tennessee, which was without Jared Goff, but he's kind of followed Jared Goff around as well, which is probably part of the connection, when maybe they're friends behind the scenes, whatever we have. But in terms of, earning targets, he had a season in 2020 with the Rams where he had 81 targets, and last season was his best season outside of that was 64. So it's not going to be a case that he takes a huge chunk. I don't expect him to step into, somebody who's getting over 100 targets, for example. I think those guys have an opportunity to do that, but they obviously have taken him in. And it's no surprise that a team that, drafts a rookie and has a second-year player would want some veteran additions in case they don't work out. So that all makes sense from the organization point of view. Moving on to the final player we're going to discuss today, and it is a tight end. Who is the tight end you've picked?
Well, Colm, I'm sorry, but I don't think it's the one that you want.
Tell me, who is it?
Jelani Woods is the one I chose today.
So that's more heartbreak for me.
Yeah, well, I don't know.
I'll forgive you.
There's a couple names here that might twist the knife a little more. So when I initially started, coming up with this article was like the end of April, early May, and Greg Dulcich was initially on the list, and I ended up taking him off just for the fact that there really hasn't been a lot of good reports out of camp.
I'm banging the drumbeat for Dulcich, even if it's just an off-season bet. Last year was K. Dotton, this year's Greg Dulcich. I still have hope. I've forgiven him.
I love Dulcich as a prospect, but he just can't get on the field. Like I was drafting him a lot earlier. Yeah, then I love his potential. And
he's not the guy we're forgiven, though.
No.
Let's go to Jelani Woods.
Okay.
I'm just going to tell people the other name. Go look at the article. The other name's Kyle Pitts. People do. So, I think people, are looking for reasons to forgive Kyle Pitts. I think there's a huge chunk of people who are done. Their hands are washed. It's over. But we'll see. So check out the upside here for Pitts as well. But Jelani Woods, somebody who has been little bits of buzz, little bits of traction at certain points, has had some spike week games, is in a situation now where we already talked about his quarterback. What are your look ahead here for Woods?
A lot of it, I mean, his profile has always been predicated on he's just like a athletic freak, more or less. He had a 91% speed score, 94% freak score. His draft capital's there. He was an early round 3 pick in the 2022 draft, which I don't think many people really realize. So he has good draft capital. Unfortunately, his statistical comps in the BSS are not very impressive. It's a lot of guys that kind of have gotten a little bit of buzz as kind of the same thing as him, like athletic freaks. Like Mike Gesicki's in there, who's had some good things, but overall I think has been kind of a letdown. There's names like Dalton Keene, who I remember hearing his name. I think he got drafted by the Patriots and never really amounted to anything. I could be wrong on that one. Drew Sample, Foster Moreau, so people that have shown some potential but never really delivered on it. And Theo Johnson for this year is in there as well. So I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing for Theo Johnson, but I think Theo Johnson is kind of exciting as well. So he really, when he was at Oklahoma State, he was not really used in the receiving game whatsoever. But it wasn't until he went to Virginia where he really saw work as a tight end. So he really doesn't have a whole lot of receiving experience when he was in college, but what he did put on tape and what he did put on the field was enough for him to still be a third round pick. So it's still intriguing and exciting, but it's just maybe there's not the statistical backing to really
the previous time you were on, we talked about Ben Sinnott, and he's going as tight end 21. But when we look at Woods, he's tight end 28. But you mentioned Gesicki, he's tight end 27, going to similar range, and another player who might even fit that mold, Jatavion Sanders, tight end 29. So when we're looking at some of the names and potential players to take leaps based on athletic profiles, another name in there, Tucker Kraft, tight end 31. There's some interesting guys down there with the athletic upside. But there's also a lot of question marks, as you mentioned, around putting all that together, and that's why they're priced down there. But there is some of these players if you're building out those kind of bully tight end or double elite tight end rosters, that a third guy at this point, if the draft gets flat, there's huge upside in these names as well. More so in tight end premium, you're probably looking to do that than at Underdog, for example. But he did have a couple of big weeks in 2022, then missed the entire season last year. So throughout the course of the season, not that spectacular, but did have 2 tight end 1 weeks, 15.3 points, 17.8 points in those weeks, and had a couple of, usable weeks, I would say, 10.7, 7.3. But again, we'll see how that can be put together for this season. I think it's more a case of how you're building out those rosters, and if you're trying to add that third, fourth tight end. I know in the FFPC and the Best Ball Tournament and the Superflex Tournament, ideally having 4 tight ends in those rosters is proven beneficial. So adding names like that at the end of those rosters is, I think, very, very smart way to play it. Is that the way you're thinking of it? That he's a third tight end and a underdog team, or a fourth tight end in the FFPC? Is that the kind of way you're still playing it, even with the upside baked in?
Yes, absolutely. I'm not advocating going and jumping up into the into round 10 to grab him. He's a good pick at pick 18, especially kind of as you highlighted with his spike weeks from his rookie year. In the first time he saw meaningful action, he was a tight end 1, and then against Pittsburgh in week 12, he was the overall tight end 2. So really, you're just looking for the spike weeks out of the round 18.
Yeah, when you're down there, if you even over the course of the season, if you can get a couple, you're getting return even at that point, that he can get into the flex spot. So I would agree with what you're building out there. He's somebody just with that profile that's very interesting. We talked about Anthony Richardson. You want Richardson to stay healthy and be in the lineup, but I feel like Jelani Woods, a bit like David Njoku last season. If Joe Flacco got in the lineup, we would see huge wheels up in that situation. But that is where we're going to leave it. The other names that we didn't talk about, there is a number of those in both articles. There's part 1 and part 2 up on rotoviz.com. It will be added to the show notes today. You can check those out. Any final thoughts as we get ready to wrap up here, Kevin?
No, I'm just going to get ready to go to work, and best way to start the day is talk fantasy football. So, I do have the next piece that I will be having on the site. I'm going to be writing up, just continue doing rookie content. The next person I'm writing up is Trey Benson. I'm very interested to kind of dive deeper into his profile. So by the time this is out, that should be on the site. And then I'll just keep knocking out rookie profiles. That's the plan going forward.
Yeah, and one of the things I've been talking about a lot recently is, people, I'm seeing more and more on social media about, the rookies or second-year players who they haven't seen it yet, they don't want to draft. And I keep explaining that the time to draft them is now. When you have seen it, when you have seen them do it in the NFL, you can't draft them at these prices. The way to win the leagues is to draft them before it happens. So we will keep looking out for those articles up on rotoviz.com from Kevin. And I will say this again, this is a love of the game recording. We did bang these 2 episodes out back to back. The first one come out a few weeks ago. Kevin recorded these at 5:30 a.m. Eastern. So shout out to Kevin for having so much good information at that time of the morning, wide and alert and full of caffeine. But that is where we're going to leave it for this episode. Check out Kevin's work up on rotoviz.com. You can find me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. And until we are back, have a good one.